It was the summer of 2000. Alyssa and Cara were 20 and 15 respectively. Despite the age gap, the two were as close as one second was to another. The sweethearts of Jacksonville. Everyone in the neighborhood knew of the sisters. With their milky white skin, soft crimson lips, and the most alluring dark brown eyes to match the luscious locks that cascaded down their backs, the two were sought after by many. Alyssa, who was of marriageable age, had a myriad of suitors. However, Alyssa couldn't be more uninterested. She was perfectly content with her life just the way it was. Her days were spent working as a hairdresser at her mom's salon, a venture she hoped to take over herself one day. It was a dreary evening, on a day when business was particularly slow, when a young gentleman walked in. His hair was dark, long and tousled, and his face unfamiliar. His gaze shifted from one employee to the other before it landed on Alyssa. Without hesitation, he strode towards her workstation and made himself comfortable before she could even offer him a seat. Alyssa didn't mind, of course. "You can do whatever you want with this." He gestured towards his silky head of hair. "Just make sure I look good." Usually, Alyssa would be thrilled to have an opportunity like this. Being given creative freedom to do whatever she wanted with a customer's hair was both a blessing and a curse. In this case, it was definitely the latter. Alyssa had no idea what she could have done to make him look better than he already did. His curly locks fell over his eyes and framed his face so perfectly. There was nothing she could possibly change. "More than you already do?" she commented before she could stop herself. He glanced up at her from his seat, smirking. "You must be bad for business," he remarked. "Oh, please. I bring the customers in," she retorted. He chuckled, and she stared. This was new to her. She was usually the one being stared at. And besides, why was she engaging in banter with someone she had just met? "I'll take your word for it." He looked her up and down. I get why. She was flustered by his forwardness, but did her best to hide it. "So, what do we do with your hair?" She hoped her not-so-subtle change of topics would help her save face. He laughed again, amused by this lousy attempt. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I most definitely think I need a haircut." Alyssa's face was red. "Let's go with this one," he said, pointing at one of the reference pictures on the wall. Alyssa nodded and began working on his hair immediately. She usually preferred working in silence, but the handsome young stranger wouldn't allow it. Much to her surprise, she found it enjoyable, so much so that before she knew it, she was done with her work. "Oh, you're done already?" the man pouted. Internally, she was squealing, but you would never have been able to tell from her calm demeanor. "That I am. You can leave now. Make sure you tip well," she teased. "Fine. Don't you at least want to know my name?" he asked. "Not really, but do tell," she responded. He smiled. Alyssa was playing hard to get. "I'm Eli. Pleased to make your acquaintance." "I'm Alyssa," shaking his extended hand. "The pleasure is all mine." Eli walked out of the salon shortly after, and something told Alyssa that this wouldn't be the last she saw of him. She wasn't wrong. Over the weeks that followed, Alyssa bumped into Eli at the grocery store, the weekly neighborhood dinner, and on one of her routine evening walks in the park. She saw him so often that he was no longer a stranger to even Cara, Alyssa's sister, who was almost always with her. At every instance, Eli made very obvious attempts at courting Alyssa, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to throw a man off his pursuit. Cara, amused by the whole affair, would tease her sister about it endlessly, to the heartbreak of many young gentlemen, but to no one's surprise. Alyssa and Eli eventually got engaged. Her parents were very much charmed by him as well, and had no objections against their union. Alyssa had never known love before Eli. Their first year together felt like a dream. He pampered her with gifts and adoration, and treated Cara, her beloved sister, with the same fondness. He claimed that she was like the sister he'd never had. As the years passed and Cara grew older, she and Alyssa drifted apart. This was not unnatural, of course. Their mom was preparing to step down and hand the salon over to Alyssa, who was so burnt out by the time she got home after work every day that she could barely arrange the time to meet anyone. Alyssa appreciated how supportive Eli was being of her. Where she came from, not many men allowed their wives to work. Eli was so understanding, and still made time to visit and check up on Alyssa's parents and Cara in her stead, whenever he had the opportunity. 5 years had passed since the two had first met, and although Alyssa was constantly tied up at work, she and Eli were still happier than ever. He had never expressed his distress at her lack of time for him. Although he himself was a working man, Eli still made sure to do more than his part when it came to household chores, simply to relieve Alyssa from that burden. He was still the perfect gentleman. Alyssa was happy with both her work and family life. Her only regret was that, during the last few years, She had almost entirely lost her close relationship with Cara. They only ever saw each other during the monthly family dinners that their parents hosted, where they would exchange life updates at most. Cara would barely look Alyssa in the face the entire night. Initially, she didn't think too much of it. After all, Alyssa wasn't around during the most pivotal years of Cara's life into adulthood. She probably barely knew her sister now. She did try to reconnect with her at the dinners, but to no avail. Eli, on the other hand, was closer to her own sister than she was. Not because Cara paid more attention to him. Her indifference spared no one. It was more so how much he knew about Cara and what was going on in her life. He would casually bring up little details about Cara's college life that Alyssa presumed she had shared with him during his frequent visits. It infuriated her that Cara wasn't making an effort to mend their relationship at all. Still, she felt like she had no right to demand that of her. After all, it was her fault that they had become so distant. When their family dinner came again, Alyssa decided that she would finally communicate to Cara that she wanted to fix what was left of their relationship. After all, she had never apologized. That might have been a good way to start. Eli always seemed to be in a better mood on this particular day every month, and Alyssa could never understand why. That day, though, she decided she would share some of his positive energy. Her newfound optimism didn't last long. The two walked into the family home only to find Cara and her parents face to face in the most intense argument she had ever witnessed in all their years together. "We're staying at a friend's place until he and I can afford our own room," Cara was saying, her eyes dark. "He?" Eli asked, the two of them finally making their presence known to the rest of the family. Eli's furious gaze pierced into Cara's, who immediately looked away. Why was Eli so mad? Neither of them even knew what was going on. They had just walked in. Alyssa assumed her husband was simply being protective of Cara. After all, he had always treated her like his own sister. For a moment, no one spoke, until Cara finally looked up. "Yes, his name is James. We registered our marriage yesterday. I'm moving out tonight," she said, her wavering voice masked with a confidence that everyone in the room could tell was put on. "How am I hearing about this for the first time?" Eli strode forward. Cara stumbled behind. Alyssa tugged at his arm. "Eli, calm down. We haven't even given her a chance to explain herself." Eli looked around, realizing everyone was looking at him after his unexpected outburst. He backed away. "Sorry, I was just worried." His face seemed to relax, but the fury in his eyes was still very much present. With as confident a tone as she could muster, Cara explained that she met her now husband at college. He was her closest friend, and Cara was convinced he would take good care of her for the rest of her life. Their dad spoke up. "Eli said he didn't have a job and that he was infamous for being a heavy drinker. Right, Eli?" Eli responded with a stern nod. Alyssa was puzzled. She understood brotherly concern, but why did Eli know so much about Cara's life that didn't even concern him? What confused her even more was how Cara flinched every time she made eye contact with Eli. Cara defended James for the rest of the night, saying that that was in his past and he no longer drank. Apparently, he was doing his best to be more responsible for the two of them. He had even saved up for months to get her a gold wedding ring, just to prove how serious he was about this. Alyssa felt sympathetic towards her little sister. She could see how much Cara cared about James. Alyssa just wasn't sure why she had jumped into marriage so quickly, without letting anyone know beforehand. It almost seemed as though Cara was running away from them. The conversation didn't seem to be going in Cara's favor. Helpless, Cara stormed upstairs to her room to pack, saying that if they didn't let her leave, she would run away, and they would never see her again. Eli rose from his chair, almost as though to follow her, and on noticing Alyssa's bemused glare, sat back down. Their parents looked defeated. Alyssa took it upon herself to go after her sister. She wouldn't stop her if this was what Cara truly wanted. Alyssa just wanted the best for her sister, and to find out what exactly that was, they needed to talk. "Hey," Alyssa said. Cara looked up at her, visibly upset. "Please leave." "No, not until you talk to me. Tell me about James, please." Cara sighed. She started narrating their story, from how they first met, up until she had finally known he was the one. She didn't tell anyone because she knew they would never approve of him, especially after what Eli told their parents. Alyssa noticed how Cara's face morphed with disgust at the mention of Eli. She asked, "How did Eli know about James?" Cara hesitated. She looked like she was in pain at the thought of having to explain this to her. The door flung open. Eli walked into the room, and Cara immediately hid behind Alyssa. Eli gently smiled in her direction. "Your parents want to talk to you, Cara. I've persuaded them into letting you go." Alyssa could feel Cara shake behind her. "Okay, I'm almost unpacking," she whispered, her voice quivering. Calmly, Eli turned to Alyssa and held out his hand. "Let's go." I'm sure she would prefer to pack without distractions. Alyssa didn't want to leave. but Cara vigorously nodded in response. "I'm okay. Thanks for hearing me out." Cara smiled at Alyssa for the first time in years. She tightly embraced her little sister, and for a second, it felt as though nothing had changed between them. That night, Cara left. No one in that room knew that that was the last any of them would be seeing of her. No one knew that they would regret not making her stay a little longer, or giving her one last hug before she left. No one, except for one person. They got the call a week after Cara had left home. It was a car accident. Neither the driver, who was far from sober, Eli said, nor the passenger had survived. Cara was gone for good. Their parents mourned for years. And Alyssa, people thought she would never recover. She had hired someone to substitute for her temporarily and took almost a year off work. Even when she got back, she wasn't the same. She didn't interact with the customers anymore. No one ever saw her smile. To make things worse, the entire time, Eli acted as though nothing had changed. Alyssa hated it. She hated the way he smiled. She hated how he pushed her to feign positivity and move on every morning because that's what Cara would have wanted. She hated the way he said her name. It didn't make sense. He was always so protective of her. How could he be so indifferent about her death? It was 2017. It had been 7 years since Cara's death, and Alyssa had still not healed. She was finally at her breaking point. At no point in the last 7 years was she able to mourn her sister in peace. Every time she tried to talk to Eli about it, or needed space to be alone with her thoughts, he would immediately shut her down, or ask her to get over it. He wasn't the same supportive husband he was years ago. To make things worse, he'd started drinking. He was barely at home, and on the days he did turn up, completely under the influence, he wouldn't even look at her. They were as good as strangers. Not that she cared anymore. Today was the day she was going to ask him to leave. It was 1 a.m., and Eli wasn't home, as usual. Alyssa had a feeling that he wouldn't take the suggestion to split very well. They were still tied down together by the pretense of their relationship. If this was going to go to court, she needed some sort of evidence to back her up. She decided to look for pills or receipts, anything that could support her case and prove his insobriety. She rummaged through the pockets of every piece of clothing he owned, but to no avail. As a last resort, she decided to look through his drawers. If he was hiding substances from her, there was no way he would keep them lying around for her to find. But she decided to check anyway. Carefully reaching into every corner of the musty drawers of his desk, she began her search. She was at the last drawer, right at the bottom, when the tips of her fingers came in contact with a cold, grimy substance. It felt like a box. Alyssa was hopeful that this was something that might help her. Dusting the cobwebs off the case, she realized that this was the box that held their wedding rings the day they got married. She rolled her eyes at the memory and flipped open the lid. A simple but elegant ring sat cushioned in one of the two wedges. She was hardly offended by the fact that he had stowed his ring away. She no longer wore hers either. She was just about to put it away when it struck her. This was not his ring. Not long after they started living together, his gold band fell through the drain of their sink. They were never able to retrieve it. She thought it was ironic how closely the instance resembled their own marriage. Her focus shifted back to the ring. Whose could this be? She wondered. She picked it out of its case tenderly, as though it could have crumbled at her touch, and inspected the piece. Her cautiousness flew right out the window when it finally dawned on her. Dropping the ring, she clutched at her chest. She felt suffocated. What was Cara's wedding ring doing in Eli's drawer? She contemplated every possible reason for it to have ended up here, and every single one pointed to one conclusion. There was no way he was capable of that. There had to be some other reason. Gingerly picking up her deceased sister's possession, she noticed that engraved in the ring were the words, "Till death do us part." On closer examination, she spotted something that made her feel sick to her stomach. A brown-red substance ingrained in the curves of the us looked back at her. This could not be. A flood of emotions surged through her at that moment. Horror, disgust, sorrow, but most of all, rage. There was no telling what she would have done if Eli had walked through the doors of their room right then. She knew something had always been off between Eli and her sister. How Cara would fidget in her seat when Eli would casually throw his arms around her shoulder. How he would gaze at her constantly when they were around each other. How uncomfortable she looked because of it. And how she was behaving around him the night she left home. The signs were all there. How could she have missed them? Alyssa did her best to calm down. She had to gather as much proof as possible before Eli got home. It was late, but Alyssa knew where to start. Cara had been journaling since she was 4. When they cleaned out her room, Alyssa did not have it in her heart to discard Cara's belongings. She had stored everything in her attic. If Alyssa could get a hold of her journals, she knew she would be able to uncover some of what had really happened. Perhaps she would never know the extent of it, but all she knew was she was either going to get justice for her baby sister or die trying. About an hour later, Alyssa laid on the floor of her attic in a sobbing heap, journal in hand. She understood now that right from the start, Cara had been Eli's sole object of affection. Their first meeting at the salon was probably all part of his master plan, but that wasn't what hurt her. What pained her the most was that her baby sister was 15 at the time and did not understand what Eli was doing to her. He'd been obsessive and inappropriate toward Cara for years, and no one knew. She was his victim. He had manipulated her into believing that everything he was doing was out of brotherly love, and Alyssa herself had fallen for it. She felt like a fool for ever believing him. How could a man be so cruel? With a newfound vengeance, she wiped her tears. She wouldn't go to sleep until she had ruined this man's life the way he'd consumed Cara's. He deserved the worst, and she would be the one to give it to him. The very next morning, Eli was welcomed by a fleet of police cars, blocking every exit of their home. Alyssa stood outside with them, smiling. This was not retribution. This was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come, and Eli would never know what hit him.